Welcome back to the Scarlet Faithful podcast. It's my pleasure to welcome to this episode Chris Peterson, co-founder and co-owner of Husker Big Red, which covers Nebraska athletics, specifically football. Chris, thanks so much for being here.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me. It's a great night always to be a Husker fan. So,
Well, big game this Friday night, short rest for both teams. Obviously, Nebraska's had quite the season already. I'm sure you're tired of rehashing all the drama that's taken place, but for Rutgers fans that aren't really keyed in, you being on top of Nebraska football, can you just kind of give us a snapshot of kind of the dynamic of what happened, expectations, where it fell through with Scott Frost, and kind of where things are at now?
yeah, I think last year Nebraska got a new athletic director in Trev Alberts, and I think it kind of started there. And a lot of people wanted Frost to get fired last season, and he had a huge buyout, like an insane buyout. And so they kind of worked out a similar deal, kind of like what Jim Harbaugh did last year. Where he brought in like a whole new staff and lowered his buyout and some stuff like that. And the idea was, I think, to try to give him kind of one more shot. Last year Nebraska was the joke was they were the best 3-9 team in the country. Because they had a lot of close games, and so I think it was like they wanted to give him one last chance to see where it went. And they lost to Northwestern the first week. Had an 11-point lead, and they pulled an onside kick up 11. And so that that doesn't help. That's not a good, especially if you don't get it. And then they struggled against North Dakota out of the FBS. I mean, it was like a tie game in the third quarter. They won that, and then they lost the next week to Clay Helton and Georgia Southern, and they gave up more yards than any Nebraska team has ever given up in a home game ever. And it was the first, yeah. So that was one thing, and it was the first time they lost like 45-42, I think, and it was the first time Nebraska had ever scored 35 points at home and lost a game. So there was some definite like historical milestones in that morning. Even though if Nebraska had waited like 2 more weeks, they would have saved $10 million on his buyout. They just decided that was enough, and so he got fired, and Mickey Joseph has taken over as the interim head coach, and lost the first game to Oklahoma 49-14, but beat Indiana last week. So now everybody in Nebraska is like on the Mickey train. So that's kind of the 5-minute answer, I guess, the 2-minute answer I can give you guys.
I wanted to, obviously Trev Alberts, former, great player for Nebraska, obviously Scott Frost as well. Is there, for someone that doesn't know Nebraska history as well, I mean, were both of them liked coming back in these roles? I guess who has kind of the better pedigree in terms of Nebraska folklore and history, and I guess how has Alberts done overall as an AD so far?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So Trev, they are very different. Trev's from Iowa, and then he came and played at Nebraska and was drafted like 6th overall. He was on his team when he was a junior or senior. They made it to the national championship game and lost on a last-second field goal to Florida State. So he was always a really celebrated player. And then he went to it was the University of Nebraska, I think, in Omaha, and he was the AD there. And he actually made some pretty bold decisions there. He actually ended their football program, and I think like their wrestling program. And so some Nebraska people were like, kind of worried about him when he got hired, that he was going to, I don't know, have something to do with the change things with the football program. But he's a Tom Osborne guy, and so he's done a good job. And I think he has handled this whole process really well. He like 20 years ago, I don't know if you remember this, but he used to be on the college game day shows and all that stuff.
I do remember. Yeah, I remember when he played. So
yeah.
I definitely, he's a name that when he came back, it was like, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think all that part of it is that like he's really good at the press conferences and saying what needs to be said and doing all like he's a good face for the school, I think. And I think football people in Nebraska like him because of his connection. Anybody that has a connection to Tom Osborne is a good thing. But Scott had that too. But Scott had a very he had kind of a conflicted history. So he's from this place. It's called Wood River, Nebraska, and they play like 8-man football, I think. He was like 8-man quarterback, and but he actually didn't go to Nebraska out of high school. Bill Walsh came and recruited him when Bill Walsh was at Stanford, and he got him to go out to Stanford to be the quarterback so he kind of like blew off Tom Osborne. And then after a couple of years, he transferred back and he had to sit out 1 year. And then so he took over the team after they had won 2 straight national championships, and they didn't lose any games. And then Jake the Snake Plummer, if you remember him at Arizona State, they went out there and Nebraska got beat 19-0 in 96, and that ended their losing streak. And everybody kind of blamed Scott Frost because he took over for like Tommy Frazier. And so he kind of had this where everybody was like, this guy's not very good. And then the next year he led Nebraska to a co-national championship. So it's like he kind of had this history of like pissing people off and then delivering. So I don't know. Everybody loved him coming back, but it just didn't work out. You know, there's a lot of reasons why, but I think the simplest one is that, you know, he never went through the grind. You know, he didn't have a recruiting strategy. He just seemed like he wasn't, I don't know. He didn't do the things that he needed to do on a daily basis, I think, to be successful, all those little things that you have to do to build a program.
So in terms of, obviously he's been gone now, I think 3 weeks. You had the bye week and then Indiana. How different did the team look coming out of the bye week against Indiana? And I guess what's kind of the pulse of the fan base now in terms of the outlook for the rest of the season?
You know, some of the fan base thinks they're going to win the Big Ten West legitimately. I mean, we're tied for first. It's a 6-way tie for first place right now. So, but you know, it is interesting because people, you know, the first game was against Oklahoma like a week after, and there was a lot of people picked like Nebraska, not even just like Nebraska fans, but a lot of people, or at least picked them to be a close game, and they just got totally embarrassed at home. And Mickey Joseph, I thought he was a little unprepared in that game. You know, it was first game as a head coach, and I was pretty critical of him. But this last week, he really looked comfortable. And from the Oklahoma game to this Indiana game, they fired their defensive coordinators. They have an interim defensive coordinator too, Bill Bush, and which I think he might actually coached at Rutgers at one time.
He was one of the under Chris Ash, which we try not to talk about.
Yeah. But well, so far, man, so they were averaging like, you know, 13 missed tackles a game because Scott Frost apparently never tackled in practice. That's apparently a thing. But last week they only had 6, and they had like 18 pressures. They had almost as many sacks in that one game as they had through their first 4. So the defense was the biggest change. The offense has been pretty solid, but the defense was like one of the worst in the FBS. And against Indiana, they at least looked competent. So that was the biggest change, I think.
Yeah, I know the defense has really struggled against the run. You know, I guess, is it, you know, has the scheme changed? Was it a depth issue? Or were there any injuries that were going on? I guess, you know, do you think that there's enough to see against Indiana that, you know, the defense it's sustainable for the year going into Rutgers? Or do you think that it's, you know, it's going to depend on kind of week to week?
You know, I haven't seen enough yet. The one game isn't enough for me to say that it's solved. And I think that there's issues there depending on who you play. You know, like their linebackers aren't great in coverage, in my opinion. I think that they're kind of susceptible there. The secondary, they're kind of thin, and defensive tackle, they're really weak. They brought in some transfer guys, and then they have kind of some walk-on types that are, you know, the type that really try hard. And sometimes, you know, they play well, but it's kind of like, you know, those guys aren't going to hold up against like Michigan and Ohio State, like that type of, you know, team. You know what I mean? But overall, I think it was kind of weird because going into the season, people really looked at the defense as going to be like, everybody thought the defense was going to be better, and the defensive coordinator didn't get fired. And I think he just kind of got, I don't know. I think he just tried to be like too mad scientist-y and do all this weird Nebraska does this really weird thing where like their nickel defender is a linebacker, which I think is just the weirdest I don't know of any other program that does it, you know? I mean, really, like usually you've got, you know, when you go to your nickel defense, you're not playing 3 linebackers, but that's what Nebraska does. And they've done it they had a guy that was kind of a unique player. And so they kind of built a role for him. Like Jabril Peppers kind of at Michigan, they had like the Viper role. And then like after he left, they're like, no one else can play this. And so they had this guy, you know, as a linebacker, Jojo Domon. And so he would always cover like slot receivers, and he was kind of a pass rusher, and he could do some different things, but it's like most linebackers against a receiver aren't going to win that matchup. And
right.
For some reason, I don't know why they couldn't figure that out, but that was one of my glaring weaknesses I saw. And I don't know if they've really rectified that. So that's the thing is I still think there's things that, good offenses and good teams are going to be able to take advantage of.
So I laugh because as Rutgers fans, like every year we're hoping the offensive line, takes
Yeah.
and that's been our biggest problem since joining the Big Ten is just not having a Big Ten caliber offensive line. And I was reading something you wrote, and I know there's been talk about the offensive line struggles with Nebraska, and then you look at Anthony Grant, he's averaging over 5 yards a carry. Your top three running backs are all averaging over 5 yards. Grant's got 600 yards for the season. I mean, how much is the offensive line struggling compared to what Nebraska's expectations are versus actually struggling as a unit?
Well, it's interesting because I think they're better run blocking than pass blocking, and
Okay.
I don't think that's that big of a shock. I mean, some guys, it's just easier. When you're a run blocker, like hey, you have to double team this guy in the A gap, or you have to chip off here and go get a line. Like what your assignment is. But if you're pass blocking, it's like you have to it's like a chess match. If you've never played the position, you have to figure out like, is this guy going to rip or swim or da da da, and then it's like, if you're not as good of an athlete, I feel like it's easier to go forward than trying to go side to side.
Right.
And so the pass protection has definitely been an issue. It was an issue against Indiana because they actually, like you said, if you just look at their running back numbers, they were good, but they got like 4 sacks and a fumble. And so they had like 60 negative yards just on, those type of plays. And one that was a defensive touchdown because the running back Anthony Grant missed a block, but also one of the offensive linemen. So they gave up a touchdown. It's like, so that's when you kind of had the weird thing. But Anthony Grant's rushing yards, to me, it's so strange because he had over like 120 yards, but he didn't have a run longer than 16 yards. So it's like he never got one of those chunk plays. So I feel like a lot of it is this guy just making things happen. And there's plays where the offensive line is doing well. And sometimes you can hide guys on the run scheme a little bit more, like, hey, we're just going to, like you can cut on the backside. You can kind of run away from your worst lineman a little bit. But in pass protection, I feel like it's a little harder to, cover those guys up. And I feel like defensive coordinators anymore, if they see somebody like that, they just run the best player pass. You know what I mean? It's not like, I feel like 30 or 40 years ago, there wasn't the matchup things. They don't like see a defensive tack or offensive guard that sucks, and they're like, hey, let's move. Where now guys moved around to find those matchups more. And in Nebraska's, there's like a bunch of them. Plus, they've 3 of their top 8 guys they basically are out for the season with injury, which doesn't help.
Oh wow, I didn't realize that. Yeah, everything's so much more specialized now for sure. So Casey Thompson, transfer quarterback from Texas. His numbers are pretty good. 65% completion rate, 250 yards a game throwing, 7 touchdowns, 4 picks. How has he met expectations so far this season?
I think he's been great. They had Adrian Martinez last year, and everybody. I mean, he's playing well.
10 years. Every year.
I know.
Martinez. I can't believe he was only there 4 or 5 years. It felt like forever.
It did feel like forever, and it sucked because at Nebraska, they played in like 13 one-score games with this guy, and they went 0-13, and now and then he goes and beats Oklahoma. So it was like that was the joke at Nebraska, was even during the bye week, because they had to watch Adrian Martinez beat somebody, that even during the bye week Nebraska was losing. But I really like Casey Thompson actually, and he actually got benched for a series against Indiana, and I think he took a bad sack, and that's I don't think it's all based on him. I think that the interim head coach is trying to send a message of like accountability, but he throws the ball pretty well, and he throws it at, and if the offensive line gives him time, like, he's dangerous. And Trey Palmer, who transferred in here from LSU's having a big season. And, they've got Marcus Washington, Travis Vokalek, transfer. He was a Rutgers guy at one point, is playing pretty well for us right now. And which you guys got Noah Vedral too, which I guess we'll see if he plays on Saturday. But yeah, our quarterback situation, I feel like, has been better than yours. I know you guys been dealing with a ton of injuries and everything. So
yeah, the Vedral situation is kind of weird because he hadn't played all year. They played him on Saturday against Ohio State, but very openly, and Shiano's tight-lipped about everything. But then even on the the announcers are saying, "Oh, he can't throw. He's only going to be running the ball." And it's like, you're playing Ohio State. You have, Nebraska on short rest, and maybe they wanted to get a little rust out, but he couldn't even attempt to throw the ball. He had 4 rushes, and then he was out of the game. He barely played, and he talked to the media today, and he won't disclose his injury, but he's, I find it odd for a veteran quarterback, and as much as he's given them, that they're like, so to speak, working him back into the flow. I figured wait until he was fully healthy to go. But I also think maybe he really, really, really wants to play Friday night against Nebraska.
Yeah.
Game 2 years ago, he was a Warrior that year for Rutgers, and it was the only game he missed was that last game of the season against Nebraska. Obviously, for a lot of reasons, wanted to play. So I do expect to see him on Friday, but again, I can't imagine he went from not being able to throw the ball on Saturday to, I mean, who knows? Shiano's might be pulling a peak attack, and all of a sudden Vedral, goes deep on the first play, but I don't see it. And so Evan Simon's been the guy, and Gavin Wimsatt, is kind of our big recruit that's been hurt. So what Nebraska get, they'll probably get mostly Simon, but we'll have to see. But I guess in that regard, with Simon, knowing what you know of Rutgers, I mean, what do you think the keys are for the Nebraska defense? Obviously, they've taken a lot of heat this year, but after the Indiana game, just what approach, I guess, do you expect from Bill Busch? Was there, were they more aggressive with blitz? Anything different you could tell us?
Well, one big thing we noticed is people kind of watching the film and stuff is that defensive backs, they started playing way up on people. Like they were giving people 6-8 yard cushions. Like, I mean, like Georgia Southern, they gave them 8-9 yard completions like all day. And they did make a lineup change. Malcolm Herzog, who was the Big Ten freshman of the week last week, he returned a punt for a touchdown and had a couple of pass breakups. He got the start at cornerback, and he played really well. So I think that he basically went from not playing at all to being their number 1 corner. And so that was kind of a shock. But there's the thing about Nebraska is they played 70 snaps on defense, and they had 4 defensive backs play 70 snaps, and the next guy played like 15. So they literally play 4 defensive backs. It's so weird. I don't know of anybody else who plays like that. I mean, really though, unless you've got like Patrick Willis, you know what I mean? Like I remember the Niners used to never have to, because they had Bowman and they had Willis, so they never had to shift out of their dime into their dime packages or nickel packages. So they were much more aggressive, and especially on the defensive secondary, they were really jamming receivers and just mostly the tackling, because from what Bruce Feldman has reported, the Nebraska never tackled in practice ever under Scott Frost. They used like tackling dummies, but they never went live pad on pad tackling in like 5 years.
Yeah, really. Yeah.
I get trying to limit it, but you have to teach people how to tackle. You know what I mean? So.
But would they not have? Did they not have scrimmages like in training camp leading up to the season?
I mean, they would, but I don't know if they were. I'm not sure how much they were live tackling on those. You know what I mean? Like with your run, like with your running backs, and I mean, because you can kind of go live without really going live, and I think that's what they were doing. It doesn't seem like they were ever, and it doesn't seem like they were going ones on ones that much either. So.
Yeah,
I don't know. There was a lot of weird things, but Scott Frost, like, for instance, and there's been a ton of rumors, but like Raiola, the kid that is Dylan Raiola, that's committed to Ohio State, he's a 5-star quarterback. Well, his uncle played for Nebraska. And so they had, he was there, and then Nebraska's offensive line coach they had a bunch of like recruits waiting for Scott Frost, and the number 1 quarterback in the country. And they got them at this house rented there, like in Scottsdale, and they're going to go visit him. And then Scott calls him and tells him he's had too many margaritas and he's too drunk and he can't make it. And yeah, I'm 100% serious. 100%.
Wow. That's so crazy.
Yeah. The number 1 recruit basically in the country that you have a shot at because of the family ties, and you can't get there.
Wow.
And so it just was. And Bruce Feldman reported, they went over to Dublin for the first game of the year, and they had a coaches meeting one of the days, 9 a.m. or whatever. And guess who didn't show up? The head coach.
Wow. Wow.
So, I mean, to me, there's a, it's like hearing all that stuff. It doesn't surprise me because that's what it looked like on the field. Just looked like nobody was. It was just totally discombobulated.
Yeah, that's crazy. So speaking of weird, it's pretty rare. So Nebraska, this is actually Nebraska's first true road game of the season. At the middle of the season, you had the game in Dublin, obviously, then 4 home games with a bye mixed in. I'm a Rutgers fan, so I always look at the worst of it. I feel like this actually could be a good thing for Nebraska to get out of Lincoln, get away from the distractions, be on the road for the first time. It is it will be their biggest road or farthest road trip of the year. I guess, how do you look at it in terms of could it be a positive for Nebraska? Is it, you're going into it's going to be a blackout game Friday night, should be close to a sellout, if not a sellout, going into a hostile crowd. I guess, what are your kind of thoughts on the state of the team going into a place like that?
It's going to be really interesting. I don't think Nebraska, I'm pretty sure, hasn't won a road game since they won that, game in 2020 against Rutgers. I'm almost positive. So it's
really,
yeah. So because I know they didn't win any last year, and I'm pretty sure that was the last game of 2020. So
yeah,
it's going to be a big test for Mickey Joseph, and he's, there's a lot of talk about the coaching search, and after this last win, people are kind of talking about him, getting the job a little bit more, and so I think there's a lot of kind of pressure on him as kind of his tryout for this job. And it's going to be a tough environment, playing on Friday night. That always worries me. You just never quite, I don't know. I always worry when it's a change of environment. You just never know how kids are going to respond to that. And I always feel like that tells a lot about your head coach, like bowl preparation. It's the teams that win bowl games or the coaches that are organized, and you know what I mean? I mean, the players matter too, but there is that element of, just the process and how you go about preparing your team for those types of trips. And so that's what I'm interested to see how Mickey Joseph's handled it, because we've never seen how he's handled it. He's never been in the situation before. So, we'll see if he can push all the right buttons. But so far, outside of that first game against Oklahoma, I think he's doing that. The players are at least playing hard for him, and they love him, and he's doing a great job recruiting. He's acting like the head coach. I don't know if he's going to be the head coach long term, but I think this is his next big step. And I think it's a game people are watching, because if he wins this one, then maybe they've got a chance to start building some momentum. Whereas if they lose this game, I think it's going to be right back to, who's the head coach going to be after the season. You know what I mean? You know how that goes.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I found it interesting too. Like Mark Whipple's comments today were really interesting, as the OC. And, I felt like it was almost like, he was showing he had Joseph's back, I thought. He was kind of like doing his own way of pumping up the team and kind of shaking things up. And I just liked his comments in terms of just, having Joseph's back, but also just, firing up the team and talking about the need for urgency. And he talked about speeding up things. I mean, how much of that has that been an issue with the offense, and in terms of, I guess, not being fast paced enough? And do you expect that to be any different, or is it just kind of a little bit of smoke maybe from Whipple just trying to fire up the guys?
It's interesting because there's been a lot of talk about, so after the Oklahoma game, Mickey Joseph, the head coach, was talking about how they needed to slow things down to protect the defense a little bit more. So it's interesting that Whipple's kind of, saying the opposite. It just depends, it depends. I don't know if they're going to view Rutgers as the same way as they did Oklahoma, but to me, it was like, yeah, you should have realized you shouldn't have been running, snapping the ball at 29 seconds. Cause that's literally, I mean, you could just see their defense just totally got gassed. And I mean, in some areas it looked like guys like gave up a little bit, but it's like, if you really think about it, like, dude, they were out there for almost like 30 minutes in a row against one of the best teams. I know they've lost their last 2 games, but I don't want to have to, fight off blocks from Oklahoma offensive linemen without getting like any rest, because they'd get the ball and it'd be like a 2-yard run, and then 10 seconds later they're running incompletion, and then it's like less than a minute and they're punting. So I feel like, depending how the game goes, he's going to be aware of that, just knowing that it's like when you're playing in the NFL and your defense isn't very good, you want them out there for as little time as possible. So I do think they're not going to play as fast as like Whipple wants them to. Whipple wants them to snap it like every 12 seconds.
Yeah. I also was thinking maybe it was a little bit of just, you want to have to think about both,
Could be, yeah,
more than maybe they were banking on.
Could be. And, the thing about it, I mean, I loved his comments about like, let's go win the Big Ten West, because I think he's right. Like, if that doesn't, I don't know if Mickey Joseph needs to do that, but he at least has to get this team to a bowl game, or that he's not going to be back. And that's the thing too, is a lot of the players aren't going to be back either. I mean, like, right or wrong, if you have a new coach come in here, like, he's going to want to bring in his own guys. Like, it's, it's almost like the NFL anymore. Like, you have to constantly recruit and kind of re-earn your job almost every year.
Yeah, those comments, I think it's a really good point, and it makes me just more nervous as a Rutgers fan playing the Brad, because I really do think sometimes these things can work weirdly where it can galvanize a team, and next thing you know, it's like you're fulfilling their potential. And yeah, I mean, Nebraska could. I mean, the West is basically wide open at this point. I thought Minnesota was going to run away with it.
I know.
Crap the bet against Purdue. So, I kind of see it that I could totally see Nebraska making a run here. I think that's the thing. Like, Rutgers has a chance for sure. I think Rutgers fans will be really upset if they lose this game. But I mean, Nebraska is still the more talented team.
Yeah, no, and that's, I mean, if you look at, I mean, I know it's rankings aren't everything, we've seen that, but if you look at the team talent, like composite rankings from 24/7 Sports, if you pay attention to those, since Scott Frost, since 2017, since he's been the head coach, Nebraska's had the most talented team in the Big Ten West every single year. So, like, they've recruited better than people. Like, coaches have always, where they have those things where they're like, coaches give anonymous comments, like, without their name. Well, the comment about Nebraska was always that they look freaking awesome coming off the bus. They look like that team. Like, if you see them in the airport, you know what I mean? Like, they look badass, but then when they get on the field, it doesn't match up. And so it's like, I've been saying this, but if you could just get somebody who's competent at Nebraska, I feel like they can really win. And it's not ever going to be like the Osborne days, and you're not going to have 39 win seasons in a row, although maybe you could. I don't know about that, but I don't think Nebraska's winning national championships anymore. But at the same time, I just want to win like a one conference championship. And it's been 23 years since Nebraska's won a conference championship, which I know to a Rutgers fan probably, it sounds shitty, but but when I grew up, man, like growing up there, they won the title like every single year, their conference. And so it's just been, that to me is what I'm dreaming of, which I'm sure you guys are dreaming of, the Big Ten title someday too.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we'd be happy with, a consistent 6, 7, 8 wins right now, and, going to a bowl. I mean, the Big Ten East is so brutal, and I mean, hopefully soon. I know there's talk of that. I thought the Big Ten would have announced it by now, so now I'm nervous they haven't. Maybe with UCLA and USC coming in, they're going to do something different. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know what they're going to do. The 16 teams the way they have that doesn't make sense to me. I don't think that's going to be because I feel like if you're going to have UCLA and USC, you've got to have more teams like Stanford and Cal, or like Oregon and Washington. So I do think it's eventually going to be like a 20-team league. And I think like Nebraska and, Minnesota and Iowa, they're all going to be part of like a bigger Western division, which I actually think will be good for Nebraska because they need places they can recruit. And, I'm looking at California and those like Arizona, those Western places, because they've just never been able to get a foothold in like Ohio or Pennsylvania or like New Jersey even, which you basically need in the Big Ten. It's just never been a good fit for Nebraska recruiting wise.
Yeah, it's interesting. I agree with you. I think 16 is not going to be the final number. And I think having West Coast teams makes sense to just build that geography, because even just Nebraska, how far away they are from Rutgers and other teams even, it definitely makes more sense. A couple more for you. I was wondering, just in terms of going into this game for you, what does Nebraska need to do to win the game? And I guess, what would be the typical ways that Nebraska could lose this game or allow Rutgers to do to win it?
This is one I say a lot, but I believe it, and I believe it, especially for Nebraska in this game. I believe they have to win the rushing yardage battle, or at least run the football effectively. And I don't think they can let Rutgers run the ball defensively, because when teams have been able to run the ball and kind of get in those ahead of the down and distance, Nebraska just has had no shot at doing anything. In this game against Indiana, they held them to 67 yards, and I think that was a huge factor. And they held them to 2 of 15 on third downs, but a lot of those third downs were third and long, and I think that made a big difference. So I'm going to watch that a lot, because if Anthony Grant isn't running the football well, I think that the offensive line just could have totally fall apart. I know Rutgers, is a pretty solid team up front. I think they've got 10 sacks so far this year, which is, 3 more than Nebraska. And I think they're only giving up like 3 yards per carry run defense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Shiano's teams are always tough, and they're always tough in the red zone. And so I feel like red zone scoring is going to be a huge thing too. Not, his teams are always kind of have that NFL mentality. I feel like, where they can give up some yards, but, hold you to 3 points, because that can be the difference between like 35 and maybe 27 or something. So I feel like getting into the red zone, and then just the turnover battle. I just don't think Nebraska can come in here and turn the football over a couple times, not get takeaways, and win the game. Because I think the line right now, which I think Nebraska is a 3-point favorite, which I think it's pretty close. I think it's pretty close to a pick'em game, really. I think that's a little disrespectful to Rutgers saying Nebraska's a 3-point favorite here.
Well, fans are frustrated because, the Iowa game was one of those where, like, Rutgers kind of was, they were certainly in their own in the first half. It was just those 2 huge turnovers that were returned for touchdowns, and that was kind of all she wrote. But they definitely had their moments where they looked like they belonged on the field with Iowa a little bit more than, we could really remember. I mean, they've only played Iowa 3 times now, but definitely their best showing in terms of just looking the part, of being able to hang a little bit, and then just had those, really 2 huge turnovers. So I think, for Rutgers is actually undefeated. They're 9-0 under Shiano since he's returned when they don't commit a turnover. So obviously that's key. But penalties have been a for Rutgers. They had 10 more against Ohio State. So how has Nebraska been with penalties in terms of committing them?
Last week was a lot better. They've struggled under Scott Frost. A lot of false start type of penalties, just stupid, kind of stuff like that. So, those are coaching points that I think were cleaned up, but 1 week isn't enough to say that some of these problems are fixed. And, bad teams tend to play better at home than they do on the road. So we'll see if Nebraska's, an okay team, because I think you've got to be a pretty okay team to go to Rutgers and win. I mean, under Greg Schiano, you're not going to show up there and be a bad team and beat Rutgers. You got to be fundamentally sound. You got to be physical, and not beat yourself. And I'm not sure Nebraska can do that. We'll see, but I think it's going to be a good test for them.
Scott Peterson, Husker Big Red, really appreciate all your great insight. It was fun talking to you, and check out Husker Big Red, part of the Full Ride Network, which I'm a part of as well. And it's been great talking to you and getting to know you as well. And good luck the rest of the season, other than Friday.
Yeah, same to you. Good luck, but not on Friday.
All right. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.